Yes. So good evening, everyone. I just want to take an opportunity and lay out some of the logistics of what we're going to be doing this evening, introduce our guest speaker, tell you a little bit about our organization. I know many of you have been part of the speaker series before. This is our fourth installment, and it proves to be a very busy November with 3 different speakers, a conference, and a whole bunch of programming going on. So given that, a couple of housekeeping, just a reminder that we are going to be filming this evening. I'm recording it. So what I always say is, just for privacy reasons, if people are not comfortable with having their cameras turned on, feel free to turn them off. If you're also not comfortable with having your name identified, you can go into the participants section and you are able to rename yourself. At the end of Kirsten's presentation, we will open up the floor for discussion or questions. If during the time you would like to post a question in the chat, you may. I will then be writing those down. I can moderate a discussion at the end, and we can go from there. So to begin, I do just need to go to my second screen here, and I would like to welcome all of you. And think about a little bit as we move into this timely topic, given a lot of the unfolding narratives around the First Nations in Canada, the reconciliation and residential schooling and stuff. I ask that we all just take a moment and recognize those that came before us on this land. And as we move through the land acknowledgement, realize that we're not all here occupying the same land, but given that, just take some time to reflect on where we live and how we use our space. I want to begin tonight with the land acknowledgement, and the Abraham Global Peace Initiative is headquartered in Toronto, Ontario. We recognize that many of the Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which we are located that precede the establishment of our organization and the giants that came before us. Coming live to you tonight from Toronto, AGPI acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations and recognize the area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Metis. Tekaronto is now home to many Indigenous peoples, and in so doing, we acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, and agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'd like to welcome Kirsten Urdahl-Serr, and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Kirsten is the District Principal of Aboriginal Education in School District number 42, Maple Ridge Pit Meadows, which is located on the shared traditional and unceded territory of the Katzie First Nations and Kwantlen First Nations. While she is of European descent, we acknowledge and respect that her upbringing on Vancouver Island has allowed her to appreciate and value the worldview of Coast Salish peoples. With an undergraduate degree in science and an MA in leadership, Kirsten's formal and informal education places her in a unique position to view the world through the perspective of people who have lived on the land since the immemorial. Please join me tonight in welcoming Kirsten Urdahl-Serr. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Neil. I really just want to say thank you very much for the invitation from the Abraham Global Peace Initiative for including me in the speaker series. I feel very, I'm actually quite humbled to bring this presentation to you, and I'm also honored to do so. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Today's lecture is on Indigenous creation, stories, and beliefs, and that intersectionality that you'll see me sort of bring up. You'll see it yourself as we move through the presentation. I will stop occasionally for questions if people have questions. However, maybe save some of those questions until the end, and I will do my best to answer them. And acknowledging as well, of course, that I am of European descent, so I am not Indigenous, and so that's that's why I may not be able to answer your question and we may need somebody here with ancestry in order to do so. So I'm just going to share my screen and make sure that we actually can see the screen, that it should have a lovely image of a Nijka Nation longhouse. And can you confirm that that's what we're seeing, Neil, before I begin? So I'm going to start with just recognizing this beautiful structure. This photo credit is mine. I took this photo in the summertime. This is the Welcome Center for the Nass Valley. It's up the northern part of British Columbia, just outside this town of Terrace, British Columbia. The Nass Valley is the traditional home of Nijka Nation, and my husband and I were there visiting the police chief of Nijka Nation, as well as local artists that I had become acquainted with. And so I had this opportunity to visit this beautiful place. The Nass Valley is, I would call, probably the most mystical place I've ever visited. Beautiful, beautiful location. Highly recommend people find their way here. So thank you again for having me. And I am going to also do the land acknowledgement for where I am, because if you're unfamiliar with British Columbia, I've given you a little sort of clip here as to where it is that I am. And I'm going to move my cursor over there. Can you see my cursor moving around, Neil? Okay, good. So I'm living here. This is the location where I currently reside, and we can see Maple Ridge is here. And I'm going to do the acknowledgement, then I'll explain what this image is. And so our acknowledgement has sort of a three-part to it, and I noticed that yours was also multi-parted. So thank you for sharing your acknowledgement. And I'm acknowledging, of course, that I am presenting to you all from the shared traditional and unceded territories of Katzie First Nation and Kwantlen First Nation. Note unceded in there. I also welcome and recognize all of the First Nations, Metis peoples, and Inuit in my community. We have a number of displaced people living here, and we'll talk about that later, of course, in the presentation. As well, I want to welcome and recognize the many different cultures that are represented in my community. So, you know, a heavy emphasis on that unceded, meaning that it had been taken. So no treaty in place. Now, the image that you see here is Katzie First Nation territory. So it actually is quite an extensive territory that goes all the way out to the delta of Fraser River, all the way through, you know, sort of the lower part of Surrey. And then as we move north, going all the way up here, and this is actually Squamish, or sorry, here's Squamish. This is Whistler all the way up here. So if you're familiar with our area here, it's quite a large area that Katzie see as their traditional territory. Very, very large. So here's British Columbia. And so the area that I was speaking of is literally just this tiny little area here. And so British Columbia is actually registered under the BC Assembly of First Nations. There's 204 First Nations in British Columbia. And so the area that I showed you is basically what we call the Lower Mainland, or, you know, the region just outside of Vancouver. So here's Vancouver City. University of British Columbia occupies the tip of Point Grey. And then this waterway that you're seeing coming through here, this is the Fraser River. And the Fraser River has a tributary coming into it. We call this Pitt River. Pitt River and the Fraser River meet here, just kind of close to this big island here called Barnston Island. Now, Barnston Island is currently Indian Reservation number 2 is what it's referred to for Katzie people. I really shudder to use the word Indian, and I will talk about that in a moment. And so this area that we're talking about here is just this tiny, tiny, tiny little area. And this is where I reside. And this is where I live, work, and play. And so I have quite a bit of local knowledge, and I'm going to try and tie in other knowledges. But because of the role that I play here, I really do have more of a local knowledge. And I will do my best to share those intersectionalities. So kind of getting in even closer to where we are here, and really talking about the people who have inhabited this region since time immemorial. We have 3 distinct areas here of the Fraser River as it comes down from Prince George. And this area in here is representing the Central Coast Salish peoples. There's about 17 dialects here alone. What we need to recognize in British Columbia is very different than Ontario, is that 50% of First Peoples languages of Canada are spoken in British Columbia alone. So this language base that I'm displaying here for you, we have upriver, downriver, and island, and it's a language group called Halkomelem. And the upriver Halkomelem is called Halkomelem. And this area is the Stolo, and Stolo directly translates in Halkomelem to river. So Stolo peoples are river peoples. So those are those upper river peoples, which also includes Sumas and Matsqui. As we go downriver, we get to an area called, well, this is sort of the entrance to the Fraser River, and the language base there is called Hunkaminam. So upper river is Halkomelem, downriver is Hunkaminam, and Hunkaminam is what the people here speak. I speak very little of it. It's a very complicated language. The people that speak Hunkaminam are Katzie First Nation, Kwantlen First Nation. Those are the local peoples I spend a lot of time with, as well as Musqueam peoples, which are the people that you find in Vancouver. Tsawwassen peoples are the people that are right at the delta, right here as the Fraser River leaves, the water leaves the Fraser River into the Pacific Ocean. There's also the Coquitlam people, also Coquitlam, we would say in our Anglophone, we say Coquitlam. And Coquitlam is sort of in this region here. It's Coquitlam in the Hunkaminam dialect. And then finally, this language base of peoples goes all the way over here to Vancouver Island. Now, Vancouver Island has several dialects, different. They're not all Halkomelem. And just in this area here in the Cowichan peoples, they speak an island dialect of Halkominam. So we have Halkomelem, Hunkaminam, and Halkomenam. So there's that slight play there on that original language base. The Comox, or sorry, the Cowichan peoples, just a little fun fact there, the region is still, of course, called Cowichan. That is Halkominam, and that means the warm place. And just an interesting fun fact there around that area, the warm place has the longest growing season in all of Canada. So it's an agricultural area. I'm just going to feature the words here of Angela Sterrett. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her. She is a CBC reporter, and this is her tweet. And I'm prefacing this whole conversation today based on what she has to say. And she says, if you are Indigenous, do you think it's okay for white people to teach others about Indigenous culture, reconciliation, storytelling, or people or communities? Why or why not? Genuinely curious to hear perspectives. Now, Angela Sterrett, she is from the Gittimax band of the Gitxsan Nation. That's very close to that first image that I showed you, and that's just outside of Terrace. And so Gittimax, or Gitxsan, is just outside of Terrace, and I actually went right through her territory on my way to the Nass Valley. She's locally situated here and is very well connected to local people where I live. And it's just something I want to just sort of pause and kind of have all of you consider is, really the, really having my voice in this. And so what I really want to emphasize here, I am not talking about or representing people. I really want to emphasize that I am of European ancestry, and I'm simply here providing information to begin your educational journey. And you're going to hear me bring in different voices today. Something else that I tend to do when I'm here, presenting to people here locally is I actually refer to myself as an uninvited guest. And that sounds really, it's kind of hard sort of phrase to accept, right? That I'm an uninvited guest. And what that actually means, and what I really want to emphasize by that, is that it means that I haven't gone through local protocol to be accepted onto this land. And I'm talking ancient protocol, I'm not talking current protocol, I'm talking ancient. And an ancient protocol is that if you come from a different locale and you're seeking to enter a territory, you have to be invited to that territory. And that invitation has to come from the people who inhabit that territory. And if you do not receive an invitation, then you're seen as actually coming with some other nefarious reason, so to speak. I do want to emphasize, while I am an uninvited guest, I am very, very warmly welcomed here by local people, very generous, warm, loving people here that represent the Katzie First Nation and Kwantlen First Nation people. And I have wonderful working relationships with people. And so I just sort of want to give a little bit of that protocol. So you might have heard this phrase, and again, it's just playing off of what Angela had to say there. This phrase is nothing about us without us. And that is a phrase people here use, Indigenous people here use, that basically says that if you are doing work, you need to center authentic voice, which means make sure our voices are represented, and certainly, you know, reach out to us if there's something that we need to explain on behalf of the people of that land. And so I just again want to emphasize that I'm here providing an education for everybody, and I'm not representing local people. So before we begin our journey together, I think that it would be really important for us to go through some terminology, because it can represent something more than just a word. And it can also represent certain colonial histories and power dynamics. So one might understand how a term might be a loaded word and used as a powerful method to divide people, misrepresent them, and control their identity. This is particularly what we see in Canada today with the term of status and non-status, which are the legally defined categories of people under the Indian Act. So currently, if you are referring to an Indigenous person living in Canada, under the Indian Act, they're still referred to as Indian. And that is a way to define a person who has status and non-status. It's a word that I would say is thankfully falling into disuse, as well as Aboriginal. So we're moving into that terminology that is honoring people and defining them through that word that really actually represents who they are. And the word Indigenous means people closely linked to the land. And so when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, this is an international word, and it's a word that's defining people closely living to the land since time immemorial. And that can be anywhere from Canada, United States, obviously parts of Australia, New Zealand. You get the idea. Indigenous peoples, Amazon peoples. And so it's the preferred word versus Aboriginal or Indian. So again, we're not using that word Indian. I work with people who will refer to themselves as Indian, and I would not use that word to describe them. It's a word that they can use. It's not a word I can use. I generally refer to people here as First Peoples or Indigenous peoples. And then when I get more specific, now this is really important. When we get more specific, there are different kinds of Indigenous peoples living in Canada. So we have our First Nations. Now I'll give you some examples. The Inuit Nation. This is of northeastern Quebec, as well as parts of Labrador. They're considered a northern people, but they are actually a nation. There's Stolo Nation, which are river people who live close to me. Tsleil-Waututh, and that's here in this lower mainland region. Katzie, so this is, of course, using Hunkaminam. The Hunkaminam pronunciation of Katzie, I can't do that. I don't have that language base to be able to pronounce it properly. And then we get into another form of Indigenous peoples, Metis. And we're going to talk about Metis people today as far as the origin of Metis people so that you have a better understanding. The word Metis in French is actually mixed blood. And then we have Inuit. Now, we would never refer to Inuit as Inuit peoples because Inuit in itself is the plural of of the word. It means people. Inuit means people. And then we have a singular person of the North is Inuk. So there's Inuit, which is plural, and Inuk, which is singular. And we would never say Inuit peoples because we're basically saying peoples. So just when you're referring to people. So Inuit is just people of the North. They are not seen as First Nations under the Indian Act. This is a very important distinction. And First Nations people receive a lot more supports compared to Inuit people. And that is, again, another distinction between First Nation and Inuit, as well as Métis. And Métis do not receive the same supports under the Indian Act either. So Métis actually have their own Métis Nation of Canada, and they've self-organized under that organization. Any questions on that before I move on? Maybe, Neil, I can get you to look at the chat or field any questions for me.
Nothing yet. And again, just to everyone, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And when we're ready, I'll ask it.
Thank you. Now, I do want to make that distinction there between Inuit and Innu Nation. Innu Nation is, as I said, it's in northeastern Quebec as well as Labrador. And these are northern peoples. However, they're recognized as a nation under the Indian Act. So while they live in the same region as Inuit, they are not considered Inuit. They are considered a nation. So there's all these little subtleties that go on. I'm going to start introducing some authentic voices here. So this is not my voice. So this is Richard Wagamese. Richard Wagamese, a very, very famous novelist. Unfortunately, I hate to share with you the fact that we've actually lost him. He did die in March 2017. Beautiful voice. If you're looking for a beautiful voice to really introduce you to the Indigenous worldview, I would highly recommend Richard Wagamese. One of his famous novels is Indian Horse. I highly recommend Indian Horse, again, as part of your educational journey, because it sheds light on the tragic history of the residential school system, while also recognizing that resilience of Indigenous peoples. So Indian Horse has also been made into a movie. So I would encourage either the book or the movie. Obviously, the book is always better, right? I'm going to be centering his voice in a few slides, just to bring his voice to this presentation because his voice is so beautiful. His last manuscript was unfinished. It's called One Drum. Now, One Drum was intended to be 7 chapters to describe the 7 grandfather teachings. And the 7 grandfather teachings are also considered the 7 fundamental truths of living a good and productive life. They vary from region to region. For Richard, his 7 fundamental truths are humility, courage, respect, love, bravery, honesty, and truth. Unfortunately, One Drum, he only got as far as humility, courage, and respect. And it was published with those pieces in place. It's a beautiful book. It's a book that you would give as a gift. It's one of those, it's truly gorgeous. And I have on this slide, just something to center this whole presentation for all of us, is that nothing in the universe ever grew from the outside in. So, holding that as we move through this in our own educational journey in learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada. So his point of view, his fundamental truths are, of course, Anishinaabe. The Cree Nation, which is in sort of the plains area of Canada, their 7 fundamental truths are: to cherish knowledge is to know wisdom. To know love is to know peace. To honor all of the creation is to have respect. Bravery is to face the foe with integrity. And honesty also means righteousness, to be honest first with yourself in word and action. Humility is to know yourself as a sacred part of the creation. And truth is to know all of these things. So that's Cree Nation. And then I'm going to take you local. Kwantlen First Nation has 7 traditional laws: health, happiness, generations, generosity, humbleness, forgiveness, and understanding. So there's a little bit of intersectionality starting to show there. And note the number 7. And the reason the number 7 is because you are the product of 7 generations before you, and you are the start of 7 generations ahead of you. And that all of those 14 generations are your circle of influence. So that's why this number 7 is used. So before we begin, thinking about that idea of that nothing ever grew from the outside in, I'm asking you all to, have your mind empty, have your heart open, and have your spirit ready to soar. And I would like to recognize Richard for those words. He also, in that part, he talks about the sacred breath ceremony. It's a beautiful ceremony. Again, I refer you to the book so you have his words. And it's similar to meditation, so, or prayer. And when we talk sacred in terms of Indigenous worldview, it's not religion. It's connected to spirituality. Another voice that I would like to sort of bring in here is the lovely Thomas King. And again, his Massey Lectures are a must. They're a must on your educational journey. You can put them into your phone and listen to them while you're walking your dog. He is very humorous. I must emphasize that he is also award-winning. So Thomas King is a Canadian-American author. He's of Cherokee and Greek heritage. He's very well known for Dead Dog Cafe. You might be familiar with that on CBC. And in 2003, he was invited to give the Massey Lectures. He was the first Indigenous person to be invited to give a series of Massey Lectures. And his most recent novel is Indians on Vacation. Indians on Vacation has won, and I must say I haven't read it yet, but I hear it's absolutely hilarious, as he is. And it's already won CBC Books Best Canadian Fiction of 2020, the Stephen Leacock Memorial Medal for Humor, the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the Canadian Governor General's Literary Award. You get the idea. He's very, very well regarded. So he's a voice that I would very much encourage you to go and spend some time with, particularly those Massey Lectures. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Massey Lectures. I'm not going to play them for you because each one is an hour long, obviously, and trying to queue up a clip. And I do very much, if you're going to listen to any, you're going to hear that sort of that intersectionality that I'm going to be talking about today. And that first lecture is called You'll Never Believe What Happened. Okay, and that lecture starts off with, there's a story I know. It's about the earth and how it floats through space on the back of a turtle. He starts each lecture with that. And it's the start of the creation story that is shared amongst peoples of North America. The Massey Lectures examine the breadth of Indigenous imagination and experience, from literature and history to social justice and politics. And it's in an effort to make sense of the relationship between North America and Native peoples who have lived here since time immemorial. So please not to perpetuate untruths, of course. So we're going to start with, a creation story. You may be familiar with this creation story, you may not. It's Sky Woman Falling. And I do have to say that Thomas King, in his first lecture, You'll Never Believe What Happened, he tells, I think, the best version of Sky Woman Falling, I have to say, because it's laugh out loud funny. But I'm going to tell the sort of a little bit more serious version that is featured in Robin Wall Kimmerer's amazing work, Braiding Sweetgrass. So there's another title that I'm offering you if you really, really want to understand Indigenous worldview. Robin Wall Kimmerer, well, she's a PhD in biochemistry, and in environmental science. She's also a poet and a novelist. Her voice is truly incredible, equivalent to Thomas King's. And in fact, I believe they know each other very well. So her version of the story, and then of course, Thomas's version of the story are very different. However, the core truth is the same. And the creation story is that we had a woman in the sky, and she was a very curious woman. And her father, I'm sorry, I actually just have somebody coming in behind me. I have a custodian coming in. I'm sorry, hello. I'm just closing this because I'm in the middle of a lecture. Sorry, everybody. So let's start again. So she was very curious, and her curiosity, it kind of got the better of her. And she was, the story goes very different in different ways, depending on if you are from the Haudenosaunee of the Iroquois Confederacy or Six Nations, whether this is told from a prairie perspective or a Cree perspective, Thomas King's perspective. But anyways, the point is the core of the story is the same, which is that the earth was deep beneath the water and there was Sky Woman. And in her curiosity, this woman was incredibly curious, and she pulled the tree up one day, and underneath the tree up in the sky, there was a hole, and she fell through the hole. And what was unknown to her at the time was she was pregnant, and she is falling because she's up in the sky and she fell through the hole. And as she's coming down towards the earth that's covered in water, the sea creatures and the water mammals and the turtle and the birds all noticed her coming, and they went, "What are we going to do?" And the birds worked together to capture her. And when you hear Thomas King, I'm not going to reveal Thomas's version of this because you have to go read it yourself or hear it yourself. It is truly hysterical. Anyways, the birds caught her and they slowly floated her down to the water, and she landed on the back of the turtle. And all of the water animals are like, "What are we going to do? And we can't have this woman just on the back of a turtle." So all of the creatures around her that had greeted her entrance to the water world, they all organized to try and figure out what to do. And ultimately what happened was each creature dove down deep, deep, deep to try and get some earth. And many of them failed, and they actually drowned in their effort to go and get some earth for her. And then depending on the storyteller, it's either the muskrat or the otter that goes deep enough to be able to capture the earth. And that capturing of the earth was in their claw. And in doing so, they dove so deep, they died, and their body floats up to the surface. And the other creatures, again, more in the passing of that animal, trying to get some earth for Sky Woman. And they open the muskrat or the otter's paw, and there's a bit of earth in there. And that earth was enough to start covering the back of the turtle. And then, of course, she gives birth to twins. Note the intersectionality. Twins. And one twin is a good twin, and one is maybe not so good. There's sort of a light twin and a dark twin. And those two twins brought all kinds of different things to the earth. They brought light from the sun and darkness. They brought the moon and the sun. They brought good and bad. They introduced all kinds of those sort of, the opposite has to be there to understand either. And so her entrance was the start of Earth as we know it today. So taking it from that water world into a terrestrial world. And so I'm not gonna tell much more than that because it's not my story. I'm just giving you sort of that overarch of the story. But what's key to this is she came from the sky and she came to a earth covered in water. And then earth was built from there. And she descended earth pregnant with 2 children. So those commonalities you'll see across if you go and look this story up. All you have to do is put in Sky Woman Falling and you will get it from different perspectives. I highly recommend both Robin Wall Kimmerer's version of it as well as Thomas King's, because hers is of course more poetic and his is absolutely hysterical. And of course we have then the birth of the earth. And what's really important to note in all of this story is that North America in Indigenous peoples is referred to as Turtle Island. So the centering of the creation story of Indigenous peoples living in North America is about the turtle. So Turtle Island is actually what we refer to North America. So local people here refer to North America as Turtle Island. They don't refer to it as North America. So just, I'm not sure if you've heard those stories before or that you were aware that there's an alternate name for North America. And then we go a little bit local. And so I'm just queuing this up. And this is the creation story here of the Northwest Coast Indian, or Northwest Coast Indigenous cultures. And so again, I'm trying to center an Indigenous voice here. So this is a telling that is on YouTube. And I believe I've linked this to the resource page that I've created for you. So here, Raven features prominently in origin tales. And so according to Haida people, for example, Raven created Haida Gwaii, which is the set of islands up the north coast. And that's just off of Terrace, the Nass Valley, where I was talking to you about. And they're about a 6-hour ferry ride to get there. And you can get that ferry from Prince Rupert. So Haida Gwaii is, that's what Raven created Haida Gwaii. So that part of those islands off of Turtle Island. And he brought the light into the world, okay? When we talk about Inuit creation stories, for some Inuit peoples, it's the wolverine made land out of rocks and mud. So creation stories may not always feature animals. They're not always about the origins of the land, but sometimes these tales speak to how all life forms came to be. So I'm just going to cue this up, and this is about 3 minutes, and this is a local story, and it's a very famous local story. Children here in our school districts in British Columbia learn this story.
Raven steals the light. In the beginning, before the great flood had come and receded, the world lay in total darkness. An old man who lived with his daughter owned all the light, but he kept it hidden away in a box because he feared that his daughter was ugly, and so they all stumbled about in the darkness. The Raven didn't like these circumstances at all. He didn't like stumbling about in the darkness, bumping into things and knocking things over, so he decided he would steal the light for himself. The only thing Raven had to figure out was how he was going to steal it. He knew he couldn't just fly in and grab the light, because the old man would hear him. So he thought, and when his daughter went down to the stream to fetch water, he got an idea. Raven made himself as small as a needle and jumped in the water. When the girl took a sip of water, she swallowed him as well, and there Raven stayed inside the girl for 9 months, slowly growing into a baby boy. Since the old man couldn't see what was going on, he didn't know about the pregnancy, and by the time the girl gave birth, he was too overjoyed to protest or worry about how it happened. The old man loved the small boy, and he doted on him and gave him everything he asked for. But the one thing Raven wanted, the box of light, was kept high on a shelf and far out of reach. When the young boy Raven was old enough to walk, he tried to steal the box, but the old man caught him in the act and stopped him. The boy Raven cried and protested and said it would make him ever so happy if the old man would just give him that box. The old man coveted the box, but his love for his son won out, and he removed the outermost box and gave it to the Raven. The next day, Raven again asked the old man for the box on the shelf, and again the old man reluctantly gave the boy the box, only for Raven to find there was yet another box inside of it. This repeated several times, until Raven started to notice the light shining through the innermost boxes. When Raven again asked the old man for the box, the old man hesitated more than usual, because there were no more boxes after this one. The old man told Raven, "I cannot give you this box, but I can let you hold the light for just one moment. Usually I would not trust anyone with the light, but since I love you so much and only want you to be happy, I will let you hold it." And so the man gave Raven the light, and almost immediately Raven took the light into his mouth, changed himself into a great bird, and flew away with the light in his beak. As Raven flew and brought light into the hills and mountains, life began to stir. He was so caught up and excited by this newly revealed land that he almost didn't see the eagle bearing down on him with outstretched talons. Swerving to escape the eagle's grasp, he dropped part of the ball of light, which scattered into small pieces and remained to this day as the moon and stars. The eagle pursued Raven beyond the edge of the world, and exhausted by the long chase, let go of what light still remained. Floating above the clouds, the sun as we know it started in the east. The first rays of the sun brought light into the old man's house. He was weeping over his great loss, and looking up, saw his daughter for the first time. She was very beautiful, and he began to feel a little better.
I hope you enjoyed that telling, and note the dark and the light again as that sort of central part of the story. And Raven stealing the light is very local here, and but that yet there's other intersectionality that I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. So again, I'm just going to center Richard's words here, and is that harmony is the energy that binds all things together, and this is a central again thought with Indigenous peoples, is about that harmony, that balance, that light and dark, and keeping all of those things in balance, because we do need both. So what I'm going to do now is just take you to where I live here. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of rocks. And again, pointing out some intersectionality here. You'll understand once I start talking about it. So Hatzik rock is a very famous rock here. It is, it's also referred to as Chaitem, and I can't pronounce it. I do a terrible job of it. But that's the basic pronunciation of it. It's been designated here as of national historic significance because of the age of Hatzik rock and its location very close to a habitation site that's over 5,000 years old. So now we're getting into archaeology here. It is considered a transformer site with Stolo people because it exemplifies the importance of preserving Stolo history, culture, and spirituality. So it's a touchstone. It's a touchstone. The heritage value resides largely in its spiritual importance, as being this association with the preservation of Stolo history, culture, and spirituality. And it represents that connectedness to Mother Earth and of the history and creation of Stolo people. So it is also referred to as, this rock is referred to since time immemorial. It is, the rock for elders is a site for elders to pass on oral history. So it is a place where people go to pass on that oral history of Stolo peoples. So very, very important rock here as that, that spiritual place deeper into the Fraser Valley. As we move down the Fraser Valley into the area where I live, so here it's an aerial image, and I tried to get a sort of more a lateral view of this for you. What you see behind this is a water area, and that water is Pitt River. This aerial view that I'm showing you is called Pitt Polder, and it's up against Pitt River. And Pitt River, if you recall from one of my first slides, is a river that empties into the Fraser River. This is the location here of Katzie people. And this rock or this formation, you'll notice It's treed, and I'm not sure how much of the depth you can see, but it's surrounded by farmlands. And it is a rock. It is a very large rock. You'll notice at the top of the screen that it's white. And this is of extreme concern to Quetzal people because it's being used as a gravel site. So we have, gravel being cut out of it for local purposes, landscaping and such. And it's called Sheridan Hill. Now, what's interesting about Sheridan Hill is it again is recounted in Quetzal oral history. And we talk in terms of this local deity called Swaniset. And Swaniset is actually the name of a local golf course. Again, it's a word, they chose that to honor, of course, the oral history of this deity. And Swaniset has been said that he traveled to the sky and he returned to earth with a wife. So again, we have this idea of a woman falling from the sky and setting down on the peak of Sheridan Hill. So Swaniset was here. Swaniset, he created the tributaries of Pitt River. He put in sort of the geological landforms of this area, this deity, or this spiritual member of Quetzal Nation. And so he did all of this sort of these lowlands. And then what he needed was a woman to come and help him cultivate. So Quetzal have been a part of this area here for over 5,000 years. They built rectangular houses on the high ground above the adjacent wetlands because this is an area that quite often will flood. And because of those wetlands, there was just an amazing amount of harvesting of plant foods that allowed people to sustain life here from local forests in the form of salal and wild raspberries and rose hips. But also because of these wetlands, we had access to, of course, the river for salmon and white sturgeon, as well as bog cranberry, blueberry, and hazelnuts and water birds because of this location next to the river and the flooding that annually could occur. Of course, we have dike systems now, so that annual flood doesn't happen. But what I really wanted to point out was it was yet another rock and of spiritual significance. In this area around Sheridan Hill, this was a surprising find. This is Waputo. And Waputo was discovered as a cultivated beds in this region around Sheridan Hill. And what's most interesting is how these beds were laid out. They were, what's been found is they had these stone sort of bases to them. So you can see the stones all around that sort of spatula or the tool that's in the middle of the image there. And Waputo is referred to as a potato. It's kind of like a potato. And, the Quetzal had been here for about 5,700 years. And this Waputo cultivation is about 3,800 years old. And so what it's telling us is that people living, again, going back to Richard's words, is that harmony with the land. They weren't like in the traditional sort of European sense where they were plowing and, seed planting fields, so to speak. These Waputo cultivations were done in harmony with the location. The Indigenous people noted where they grew best, and then they created sort of in harmony with the land seedings of these areas, and also that bottom to keep them protected. And they were being cultivated and were a food source that were traded up and down the river. So a very interesting archaeological find here. This was obvious, it made sort of headlines here locally because it did establish the Quetzal community as being here as very much, even though oral history has told us over 5,000 years, it very much substantiated that because these were carbon dated to about 3,800 years ago. And then as we move up the coast, talking again about establishing communities, this is another interesting artifact of people living in this region. These are called clam gardens. And again, this is an aerial view. And they're ancient as well. They are up and down the coast. We actually have what's called the clam garden network here because as they're discovered, the archaeologists are adding them to that network so that those locations can be tracked. And they're an intertidal feature. They are constructed by coastal First Nations here in British Columbia, as well as people living below the 49th parallel in Washington state, and as far as Alaska as well. And it was used to enhance shellfish productivity. Again, working in harmony with the land, they were, people constructed these rock walls, and you can see that. I'll move it here, and this is sort of that intertidal zone. And you can see this rock wall here that was constructed by the local people. And what they did was they transformed naturally sloping beaches or rocky shorelines, and they transformed them into level beach terraces. And what that encouraged was for clams to self-seed there. And that allowed local people to be able to harvest clams throughout the year. So again, working in harmony with the land to build that productivity of a food source. So just a very interesting, archaeological find here. And again, I want to emphasize these archaeological finds I'm speaking of are being noted by, of course, local Indigenous scholars. This was a very interesting study done up in the North Coast. This is past Haida Gwaii, so now we're going really far north coast, moving into almost Alaska. And this is grizzly bear. And again, Indigenous scientists working alongside sort of Western scientists to discover the relationship between local language groups and grizzly. And what they found was, you'll notice this sort of the blue, the green, the red, those are the language groups. So the blue, the green, and the red. And remember, 50% of Indigenous languages come from British Columbia. And these are three separate sort of language groups of people who have been living in these areas since time immemorial. And what they found when they were doing sort of hair analysis of the grizzly bears living in this whole sort of triangular region was that the grizzlies also had a very close relationship with people. And the grizzlies were all distinct genetic groups. So this again talks in terms of Indigenous peoples living in harmony with the land, including the animals living in harmony with the land, and that overlapping of living together in harmony. So this was a very famous study. It was published through science.org and summarized by Rachel Fritz. You can find this online. It's just a beautiful study that had been going on for a number of years. So all of the things that I've been talking to you about are all pre-contact. And so where I'm moving you next is now post-contact. And this is when we have our early European explorers coming. The image that I'm offering you here are the voyageurs, who are by and large French. There was also people that came from Scotland as well, to try and reap some rewards from this land, mostly in the fur trade, as well as obviously people coming to settle and to farm. But the group that is of most importance here when we're talking about Indigenous peoples is, of course, the voyageurs, because if you can see by the image, they were men. And when you come as a young man to try and seek your fortune in a strange land that you hadn't visited before, you are obviously wanting, a companion, and the voyageurs relied heavily on the knowledge of Indigenous peoples living in this, obviously in this land. And they also then formed families with Indigenous women. And that arrangement allowed the voyageurs to rely on local knowledge because they would get it directly from their wife. And the children born from these relationships are the Métis, the start of the Métis Nation. So what's really just important here around these voyageurs as well is that when the woman of that nation married the European man, she lost her community. And that's a really important understanding, that she chose to live this lifestyle with this man from another world, And that was the start of that segregation of Métis from First Nations, a very sort of notable start. And when you speak with Métis people, they talk about the fact that their mothers were basically taken from that community and put into this lifestyle to, go and hunt and trap with their European husbands. So I'm going to talk about now an important one that's here locally, of course, Simon Fraser. So Simon Fraser is, he's the man who basically was the explorer that opened up British Columbia. He did that using the river systems here. And that's the reason why we have the Fraser River. So that large river that runs through British Columbia is named after Simon Fraser, as is our local university. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here because I'm going to just queue up for you this little bit around Simon Fraser here. And I hope that you can see that new screen. Neil, can you nod because I can see you? All right.
Yes, we can
and
see
so
it.
We are going to have a little oral account now again from local people. And the first person to speak here, I'm just grabbing my notes because I left them here. The first person to speak here, you'll have a gentleman from Musqueam Nation. I'm trying to remember his name, but then we get into Jim Q, and then Sonny McKelsey, and then we're going to end with Ed and Cyril Pierre. And the reason why I'm showing you this little account is to sort of underscore that discrepancy between how European people might see Simon Fraser and how local people see Simon Fraser. This montage, there's a longer here, was done by Dr. Amy Parent. She is a tenured professor with Simon Fraser University. And it is this segment is called, "Can you please tell us about Simon Fraser's interactions with your community?"
Been a really thriving society. But in 1762 in the winter, that all changed quite dramatically. And in that winter, 60% of Coast Salish people died of the smallpox disease. So put it in a time frame, 20 years later, Simon Fraser came down the river and he encountered abandoned villages.
When I was a youth, I was taught that my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother dispatched our militia to apprehend Simon Fraser for the theft of a canoe at Kakate. And when I read Simon Fraser's journal, I see that he was very persistent in trying to acquire the canoe, but he doesn't say how he acquired it. He does mention threatening the people at Kakate to try and acquire the canoe. Our version of the story is that he introduced whiskey to them. They had never seen it before. He got them drunk, and when they were passed out, he left some crappy trade goods on the beach and stole their canoe. When they found out what had happened, they dispatched runners, couriers. They came to our community. We knew to expect them. We tried to apprehend him. You don't see any of that in his journal.
Okay, but it didn't take long for people to understand that he wasn't Kakels. I mean, even when he got down as far as Skowlitz, which is at the mouth of the Harrison River, if you read his journal, those people had a big potlatch, big gathering for him as well, welcoming him, but for the same reason, they thought that he was Kakels returning. But of course, once he got down to the mouth of the river, to where the Huemethquium is, he ended up stealing a canoe from them, and so the Huemethquium ended up chasing him upriver. And as far as I can tell, they chased him probably about as far as Matsqui or Abbotsford or somewhere around that area. But he continued back upriver, out of our territory.
So I feel that the explorer Simon Fraser, in my opinion, my head, he doesn't exist to me. Our people lived in this river for centuries and centuries, and he come along and discovered and put his name on it? Wow. No, I don't go with him. I'm glad he made it home. had his family started and stuff, but in my heart, he left me bad feelings. That's all I can say.
So thank you, everybody, for enjoying that different account, shall we say, of Simon Fraser and his journey. And so I'm just going to continue. I think I'm going to have to escape from this whole thing because I need to reshare. So I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm just going to reshare because I need to move on to the next slide. And I'm sorry for the moment here where I'm going to come from the current slide and then I need to reshare. So that video that I shared with you just now is, it is locally done. Dr. Amy Perrant actually is, she is leading our current equity and action scan here in the school district. I'm not going to get into that, but it is a very large scale project. And I do find that account of Simon Fraser and his shenanigans, shall we say, along the Fraser River, a very interesting account. So now we're going to move from that voyageurs, sort of those people that explored, to the people that really began to become that Métis nation. And of course, they can trace the Métis people trace their ancestry back to the Red River settlement of Manitoba. They are the founders of Manitoba. And Louis Riel being that first sort of leader of Manitoba. And he was contacted by Métis people in Saskatchewan that had government grievances regarding rights. And in his role as that leader of Manitoba, in that settlement of people that were establishing themselves as that Métis nation, he took on that role to go and take on that sort of that conflict with government and Métis leaders in the neighboring province. This now led to that armed conflict. And if you know anything about history, we call that the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. And the Métis were defeated in the Battle of Batoche. And Riel was convicted of high treason and was executed by hanging. This, of course, inflamed all of the English-French relations because, of course, the majority of Métis people were French. And of course, that was already a challenge in that sort of early part of forming Canada, and that just, you know, his treason and subsequent hanging, of course, just continued to inflame that relationship, particularly with English who were now settling through the prairie provinces where the Métis people had been starting to be pushed into those areas in order to settle and have land. So, you know, when we talk about Métis people, there is a lot of concerns from them around the establishment of their nation, the recognition of their nation, and the lack of land rights associated with the nation, and that they are not included as part of the Indian Act. So that kept them up from a lot of sort of rights that people who are First Nations were able to sort of accept. I wouldn't say that it was more than that. It was that they were able to accept. However, the Métis people were left out of that. So I'm just, you know, moving now. I know that we're sort of late start in this presentation. So I am just going to talk about a couple of small things before we just sort of close. I want to just recognize that we are moving towards Remembrance Day. What you may not know is that there's also a National Aboriginal Veterans Day. And, you know, we're talking history, we're talking post-contact, and we're talking about how Indigenous people have been treated in Canada. You know, we haven't delved deeply into that, obviously, but I do want to highlight this because it is November and we really should be talking about it. That November 8th, of course, is recognition of Aboriginal contributions of our Indigenous peoples or Aboriginal peoples, contributions to military service, particularly First, Second World War and Korean War. It occurs, I just said, on November 8th. And its memorial was inaugurated in Winnipeg in 1994 and has since spread nationwide. And so why do we have a separate day for the Indigenous veterans of those wars. And it's to recognize the contributions of people. And here's one person that I would like to speak of. His name is Charles Tompkins, and he's a Canadian code talker. Everyone called him Checker. And Checker was a Métis man from Alberta who spoke Cree. And he was enlisted and then, brought into sort of that army sort of headquarters because he was going to be, because he could speak Cree as well as a number of other members of the Canadian Armed Forces who were Indigenous that could speak Cree, became part of this code talker network. And they were able to translate messages between, different parts of that war effort in Cree because other European nations didn't understand what they were saying. So they had no idea what language he was speaking code in. Something that's really interesting about the veterans, Indigenous veterans, is that they received a one-time payout of less than half of what a non-Indigenous veteran were able to access. And then to add insult to injury, reserves even had land appropriated by the government to give to returning non-Indigenous veterans. So this is an important piece in that relationship between Indigenous peoples living in Canada and the Canadian government. They, were there to provide that support during these armed conflicts, yet weren't honored for their contribution. So, when November 8th comes around, please think about Charles Tompkins as well as the other code talkers that were enlisted. And then, of course, we can't talk about post contact without talking about Indian residential schools. And they are called Indian residential schools because Indian is actually the legal term under the act that we use. It's not a word I like to obviously use, but it is the word that is associated with the schools. These schools operated in Canada between sort of 1870s and 1990s. The last one closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. Children between the ages of 4 and 16 attended Indian residential school, and it's estimated that over 150,000 children from First Nations, Inuit, and Metis were attending schools. And of course, the image that I'm sharing with you here is of Tecumlets, and this is the Kamloops Residential School, where the first 215 children were located in unmarked graves. We, of course, know that many more have been found, and I believe the recent count at this point is over 7,000 across Canada. So just sort of acknowledging that before I finish today. And I'm going to speak the words on behalf of Art Solomon, an Ojibwe elder. And knowing all of this, knowing the wholeness of people before contact and what happened after contact, and recognizing that change and that difference to people's lives and lifestyles and well-being, I'm going to speak his words on, if you so allow me to, which is that grandfather, look at our brokenness. We know that we are the one who are divided, and we are the ones who must come back together to worship and walk in a sacred way. That by our affirmation, we must heal the earth and heal each other. And this is from Songs for the People, Art Solomon, Ojibwe elder. It is also found in One Drum, Richard Wagamese's book. And I feel that it speaks of the resilience of Indigenous peoples living in Canada, that they recognize that they are able to come back. And I see that in the local people here, that there's that healing. And it is really focused on each other and the earth. And it's those are beautiful words. In the background, you see sage burning, which is very well recognized medicine. I'm not going to read all of this, but I am going to point out this book for you. It's called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. The Indian Act is a very large act. The 21 Things book is written locally by Bob Joseph. He's a local person who provides sort of corporate presentations on Indigenous peoples, as well as Indian Act, so people really understand how this act really provided that pathway to assimilate people and to strip people of culture, heritage, language, and self. And so this is a book that I do encourage people to read. Of course, we can't talk about residential schools without speaking of truth and reconciliation. And, you know, just coming out of that report, a very important quote that there has to be an awareness of the past and acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted and atonement for the causes and action to change behavior. And so what are those actions? And I'm just going to run through this really quickly for you of what's happening here in British Columbia. In 2015, we had the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous People. We also simultaneously had the closing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had been going on for a number of years, as well as from the Office of the Attorney General, a report of the harm that Indigenous peoples had received as a result of the Indian Act and other assimilative practices. Here locally, that created a call to action for public education. In 2010, we had a curriculum review, but by 2015, we had a complete redesign. And that redesign of our local curriculum here for kindergarten to grade 12 really focused on taking responsibility for past harms, for building knowledge, skills, and advocacy around those past harms, and building in trustworthy measures to move forward in a good way. A lot of work here to be done on that. We are in year 6 of that implementation of that redesign, and we are seeing a noticeable change, but we have a long way to go. So I'm going to finish with some words, and again, this is from Wagamese. Can you stand? Waboos asked. Yes, Buffalo said. Why? If you stand there calmly, you won't sink any further, and we can work together to get you out of there. Are you certain? Buffalo asked. I feel the bog pull at me even now. I am not certain, Waboo says, but trust does not require certainty. So I close with those words by Richard Wagamese, and also in the words of the incredibly beautiful and wonderful Justice Murray Sinclair, former senator, and he was chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2009 to 2015. And his words are, education is what has got us here, and education is what will get us out. And I thank you all for joining me today in this very special presentation to all of you. And I do want to acknowledge my privilege as a white settler for me to be able to share this information with you. And I say in local word here, I say, Hajka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting and enlightening presentation. And I like you touch on so many key moments in Canadian history that, while not a lot of that is veiled, I think that the true narrative, the authentic narrative, the Indigenous narrative of a lot of this history remains veiled, especially when it comes to the horrors of residential schooling, colonialism, and, you know, as the elders had spoken about Simon Fraser, and I had to giggle because, you know, I've heard this idea of, you know, we were here. I didn't need the white European to discover me. I knew I was here, which is a lot of that same narrative I hear from students from the Caribbean who speak to Christopher Columbus the same way. You know, I'm so glad that he sailed the 7 seas just to find me, but I was always here. So I thank you for bringing that, because that's a practice that, or that's a piece that drives my own practice, especially as a history teacher. So thank you very much. There were a couple of questions. Freeze in the middle. Daniela, you had a question about the term Aboriginal. Did you want to ask that? And if, oh, there.
Oh, hi. Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering, in many textbooks, and I've often heard teachers, even myself, when I had to one time teach social studies in grade 7, I was very careful not to use the word Indian. I used First Nations a lot, but I did refer to the peoples as Aboriginal. And now I'm just wondering why that is not a good thing, or is that negative? Is there a negative association with that, or is it just?
There isn't. It's because here this department is called the Aboriginal Education Department. I do not have the right to change the name of this department. That is not for me to do so, because I recognize my privilege as a white settler to work in this department. If that name got changed to Indigenous Education Department, it would be because the people of this department would acknowledge that they want to see that change. So Aboriginal, the reason Aboriginal is kind of a funny word is because of the prefix ab. So when you think of what that means, and you break the word down, original, absent.
I see. Right. Okay.
Right.
That makes sense.
So it's a word that is not used internationally. It is used in Turtle Island. It's used in Australia and New Zealand.
Right.
But internationally, people who are associated with the land, the more respectful word, I would say from an international point of view, is Indigenous. However, it is the people who need to choose the word that describes them, right? And that's why people that I work with will refer to themselves as Indian. And the reason they do that is because that is still how the people here of Turtle Island are referred to in the Indian.
Right. Okay, that helps. Thank you.
So they do that because it's that, that's what you call us, right? And I agree with them because, that the Indian Act still exists. Yes, there's parts that have obviously been removed or are not in practice. However, there is, and the other piece of this is Jody Wilson-Raybould. I must say, if you're interested in around like, why do we still have the Indian Act? You might want to go see her interview with CBC around why do we still have the Indian Act? And the question that she was asked, I think it was by Mercedes, I can't remember, the main reporter with CBC, what's her last name? Anyways, a fantastic interview because the question was to Jody Wilson-Raybould, do we still need, thank you, Mercedes Stevenson, do we still need the Indian Act?
Right.
And Jody Wilson-Raybould talked very eloquently about why, yes, we still do.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. I do know that Rebecca had posted, as well as Chief Armand, and I'm still going to refer to as Chief Armand, some comments in the chat. I don't know if you want to speak to that further. I want to give you the floor there. Just about Michelle Latimer and
Michelle Latimer. Yeah, that's a very unfortunate situation because she had been hired by CBC to produce the Trickster series by Eden Robinson, and just fantastic literature. Again, I highly recommend anything that Eden Robinson writes. And Michelle Latimer was claiming that she was a member of a community, and that community said, I'm sorry, but you don't have any, who are your relations, right? Who are your family members of this community? And so she was claiming a relationship with a community that found to be, in their mind, the community, they felt that it was a fraudulent claim. And that was sort of the reason why her sort of ancestry was questioned.
And there's Armand Labarge. Do you want to comment as well? Oh, you are
muted.
Oh, we can't hear you, but you're not on mute. Nope.
Oh, that's too bad. His
sometimes that happens with my students. So what I would say is maybe try logging out and coming back into Zoom. Such a common issue. In the meantime, while he does that, because I know there's a lot of stuff he can add there. So try that. I'm going to pose my question while he figures out the tech issues. Mine is long-winded because that's kind of the way I am. So I'm also going to copy and paste it into the chat just because, but mine is more about, there it is. One of the barriers and breakdowns that we, and when I'm talking about we, I'm referring to teachers have with students, is in centering their experience in people's, others that they've either never met or with histories that don't reflect their own. Be encompassing 50%, and I put all spoken languages, but I meant all the FNMI or First Nations language, and a province made up of so many First Nations and Indigenous peoples. as well as a growing population of settlers or non-FNMI people. How do you, as an educator, find a common thread and create spaces for shared dialogue where we can tie in indigeneity or Indigenous knowledges with the often foreign lived experiences and pathways that brought students, communities, and individuals, and you put it, these uninvited guests together? That's why I pasted and put in the chat there.
And yeah, so like an uninvited guest, I'll give another example of an uninvited guest is Dr. Amy Perrant, who did the clip around Simon Fraser's account. She is Nijga Nation, but she's living within the territory of Squamish Nation. So she refers to herself as an uninvited guest, again, going with local protocol. So anybody who is coming from any part of Turtle Island or Europe, or if you're not living within the territory of your nation, you are technically an uninvited guest. And, you know, that it's an old tradition that's still practiced today, that if you arrive, especially here in the coast area, if you arrive in a nation's territory that is not your own, and you arrive by boat, if you come in peace, your Indigenous nation or your nation's logo is facing out on the paddle. And if you come for nefarious reasons, meaning we're coming to take your territory or for whatever conflict, the side of the paddle that is not carved is facing out. So you, therefore, if you then come onto the land with that part of the paddle that is not carved facing out, that means that you're an uninvited guest. So we have not actually been invited formally by, you know, showing the right side of the paddle of our canoe. And so it's just recognizing that. It's just similar in sort of, you know, anti-racism work, recognizing your privilege. You know, you're just recognizing that you haven't met that local protocol. And so how do we do that work here? Well, you know, what's happened because of the assimilative practices that occurred as a result of the Indian Act, which took people from their communities and took them to locations, you know, in a different area for a residential school, or broke up families. What happened is we have that, you know, it's like a diaspora, right, throughout Turtle Island, where people became unlinked and away from their culture. And so we are working hard to build that culture. And the members of the department here are from all nations across Turtle Island. We really do try to find that range of people, because the children attending schools here are also from that range of experiences. I have in this department, we recognize almost 1,400 students in this district, which is about 9% of the population with Indigenous ancestry. And only 55 of those students are actually living on their actual territory. Only 55. So the large majority of students living, working, and playing and educating in this territory are uninvited guests. And they are from all nations. And so how do we do that, right? We have to bring those cultures, all those different perspectives. We bring elders and knowledge keepers that have that perspective. We teach our staff teach the kids. It's a lot. And then of course, the languages alone is an entire department in the Ministry of Education here, the revitalization of languages. There are parts of British Columbia where the language was not taken because there was enough people remaining and they hadn't been impacted by disease or other things, that there was enough language speakers remaining that language was more easily revitalized because children lost the language when they went to residential school, whereas other areas were more impacted by disease. As you could hear from the account with Simon Fraser, that as he went up and down the river, because it was such a main waterway, so many people were impacted by that smallpox. And so we've had a larger language loss here. So in this region here, there's about a half a dozen that I'm aware of that are still able to speak and teach, but we don't have enough for local people like non-Indigenous folks to learn the language. The primary care of right now for language revitalization is local language knowledge holders with people of that nation. That's the focus right now.
Interesting.
I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. Thank you very much. And fingers crossed, Armand, is it working?
I think so. Can you hear me now? Very
Yes.
good. Yeah. I was just commenting in the chat about the Latimer situation, and there's CBC did a fairly extensive expose involving Dr. Carrie Barassa from the University of Saskatchewan. She's a very respected health researcher, and her claim or assertion that she's Métis, Anishinaabe, or Tlingit has been called into question, and they're asserting that she's actually Eastern European. So what they're calling it is a modern day gray owl situation. And we understand and appreciate the sensitivities associated to those types of claims. So.
Absolutely, and especially that it's the nature of it's the nature of the familial relationships. And if you are laying claim to having a certain ancestry from a certain place, then that means that you must have connections in that place. And if you don't have connections, then that ancestry will definitely be called into question. Right. Definitely.
And Neil, just an aside as well, great presentation, Kirsten, but my doctoral research is focused on police response to what they call Indigenous critical incidents in Ontario, but it's First Nation occupations, protests, and demonstrations, and how that has changed significantly in Ontario post-Ipperwash, and with the introduction of a protocol called the OPP framework, and how that is now a national framework, and how police are exercising much more discretion and appreciating that there's often legitimate claims to the actual occupation of these lands. So the days of going in and using excessive force to try to remove individuals, much to the consternation of individuals in the community or the government, have long since passed, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and it is around that. Here in British Columbia, we've taken the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and here in British Columbia, it is an act. So it's the Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in British Columbia. We are the only province in Canada that has adopted that United Nations Declaration as an act in our provincial legislature. And so recognizing the rights, particularly around land and language and culture, it's moving right now through, there's a draft sort of action plan, and that draft action plan is moving through Indigenous groups through British Columbia. So I was responsible here to ensure that I got that information out to local people so that they could respond. And those next steps were just presented to us last week as provincial leads in Indigenous education, that there are the next steps. And so we're going to start seeing that act enacted, which will be very interesting from a political point of view nationally for people.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Okay, so seeing and hearing none, I'm going to say a big Chi-Miigwech, or thank you very much, as the Anishinaabe in the area would say. A big thank you for taking the time. Today is Monday, so staying late at work on a Monday is very tough. But thank you very much. I know that there's a lot. I took a lot of notes because my computer crashed halfway through. These resources, for those of you still here, I'm going to send those resources out to everyone who registered with links. I was given Richard Wagami's book, One Drum, as a thank you. And what an outstanding set of inspirational quotes and stories. And I didn't know that he didn't end up finishing the book. So I would ask you all to go out and buy it. It's one of those, it's more than just chicken soup for the soul. It's a lot deeper. Thank you very much for taking the time tonight to speak with us, and all the best. Thank you as well to everyone else who's joined us.
Yeah, thank you all for joining tonight. And I want to give my thanks to the Abraham Global Peace Initiative for including Indigenous worldviews in the program, and also to both Neil and Avi for having me here tonight. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. All the best. Everyone, be well, stay safe. Thank you.